So before you start your skin-on frame boat build, you're going to want to take a few minutes to sharpen your edge tools. Now, we don't use very many edge tools during this process, just a low-angle block plane and a couple chisels, and that's pretty much it. Now, keep in mind that this is not fine woodworking, so you don't need precision level sharpness. Now, if you want to, you can spend a small fortune on high-end edge tools and high-end sharpening equipment, but typically that's not necessary for this type of boat building, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get a better result. Now, on the other hand, there is a level of quality where things get so poorly made that you can't get a sharp edge and you can't make the tool run cleanly. So it's really about striking a balance between something that's high enough quality to get the job done, but not so high quality that you're just wasting money. Now, what I'm going to do here is just take a few minutes and walk you through my personal choices in chisels and block planes. We're going to take the tools apart and I'm going to show you how to dress them and set them up properly. And then I'm going to show you different choices in sharpening equipment, and finally a really fast, efficient system so you can put a good sharp edge on your edge tools and get to work. So starting with the chisels here, I've got a 3/4 inch chisel and a 1-inch chisel. And these don't need to be particularly high quality. Both of these are just kind of hardware store quality chisels. And these aren't just crappy chisels I put up here for demonstration. These are actually the chisels I use every day in the shop. Now, of course, if you have high quality chisels, those are going to work as well, but this would work just fine for the limited amount of chiseling we're going to be doing. Now, moving on to the block planes over here, I'm going to have a lot more to say about models and manufacturers here in a second, but let's just take a moment to go on a tour of this tool. Now, on the back here, we've got the cap, which is held down by this screw and this lever right here, or this thumb screw right here. And if you remove the cap, you can see the blade. Now, the blade in a block plane always sets in there with the bevel facing up. And the blade sits on top of what's called the frog, which in this case is just a piece of metal that's cast into the plane body. Now, back here we've got the adjustment screw, which turns clockwise to engage the blade for a deeper cut and counterclockwise to disengage the blade for a shallower cut. Now, up here you can see there's a little brass knob, and this gives you a great place to put your finger while you're driving the block plane. But if you loosen this knob and turn this lever right here, you'll see that that opens and closes the throat on the bottom of the plane. Now, for most of the woodworking we're going to be doing, you're going to leave the throat completely wide open. The only time you really close down the throat in woodworking is when you're working with really difficult hard grain, and you usually have to have a razor sharp blade to do that. Now, you can also remove this lever here, which allows you to take everything apart. And at this point, you've pretty much disassembled the whole plane. And I would recommend doing this when you first get your plane, because if you've got a new plane, especially if it's a lower quality one, you might have to do a little bit of work with a file or some sandpaper to get all these parts running cleanly. And if it's an older plane, there's probably going to be crud in here that you're going to want to clean out. Now, we'll talk a lot more about how to set this back up after we sharpen the blade. Now, before I start talking about different models of low-angle block planes here, I just want to mention that plane selection is highly personal, which means that planes that don't work at all for me might work really well for you, and this might be a good thing because there's not a lot of low-angle block planes that I feel like I can really recommend right now. Now, the block planes that I find myself using most often are this old Stanley 60.5 or this old Record Marple 60.5. Now, the Stanley 60.5 has been the classic block plane all the way up until about the mid-1990s, when the quality of these really started to deteriorate. Now, up until about 2010, you could still pick up the newer version of these, and if you put a bunch of work into it, you could get one of these cutting really nicely, and you could have a really good block plane on a fairly reasonable budget. Now, in recent years, the castings on this and the quality control has deteriorated so badly that it's pretty hard to get one of these working again, which really leaves me in a place where I have a hard time finding a plane to recommend, because all the other block planes in the sub $40 range are completely unusable. And then when you jump up into the $100 range, where you have the Veritas planes, the Stanley Sweetheart, the Wood River plane, all of those should be just beautiful woodworking tools, but for whatever reason, they never feel right in my hand, and I can never get them working the way I want them to. And so at that point, I'm left to look even higher than that at the $165 Lie-Nielsen 60.5, which is a copy of the old Stanley 60.5 block plane, except for the fact that it has an A2 tool steel blade. Now, A2 tool steel is a lot harder, but it's also a lot harder to sharpen. And in practice, what I find in the shop is that if I have an A2 tool steel blade, I'm less likely to resharpen it, so I end up using a dull tool for longer. Whereas if I'm working with just normal carbon steel and my blade starts to lose its edge, I just gotta pop it out, put it on my stone for a minute, put it back in, and I've got a razor sharp plane to work with. Now, not everybody is going to share my personal disdain for A2 tool steel, which means that Lie-Nielsen $165 60.5 is going to be an absolutely beautiful, super high quality, well manufactured tool. Now, if you're working on a budget, I'm not sure I have a really good recommendation at this point. You could always try to get the newer Stanley low angle contractor grade block plane, clean it up, sharpen it up, and it might work at least okay for a single kayak build. Now, those particular planes have one huge flaw, and that is the pivot point for the throat adjustment protrudes into the throat itself, which always tends to load up shavings, which clogs the plane. It's super easy to fix though. You just take a file and you file off the underside of that, and then it's gonna run a little bit better. Other than that, I really think that your only good choice is to try to find yourself an old vintage Stanley 60.5 or one of these older record Marple 60.5s right here. You probably could still pick one of these up in reasonable condition off eBay for somewhere around $50. And it doesn't matter if these are super dirty. You can clean them up and they'll be perfectly fine. You just have to make sure that you get one that's not damaged. Now, if any of you out there have experience with a good medium quality block plane that doesn't have any major flaws, definitely send me your feedback. I'd love to hear what's working for you because I'd love to find a mid-range block plane that works really well. So moving on to the sharpening side of things, there's lots of different kinds of sharpening stones and lots of different sharpening systems. And so to keep this video from being way too long, we're just going to focus on sharpening with water stones and sharpening with a honing guide. Now, there's lots of different grits of stones, all the way from, say, a 300 grit, which you could use to regrind the angle on a bevel, all the way up to, say, a 15,000 grit that would give you a mirror finish that you could shave your face with. Now, personally, I'm a minimalist, so I like to have the least amount of things possible, which means that for my sharpening system, I'm working with a 1,000 grit stone and either a 4,000 or a 6,000 grit stone. Now, the 1,000 grit side of that is going to be aggressive enough that it'll carve the scratches out of a brand new chisel or planer blade, and the 4,000 to 6,000 side of that is going to finish it up enough that you're going to be able to take good, clean shavings, at least if you're working in softwood. Now, if you're doing a lot of planing, especially of end grain in hardwood, you also need to jump up to something like an 8,000 grit stone, and it's helpful to have a leather strop after that. So the choice that I recommended for many years was just to get yourself a Norton 1000-4000 stone because it gives you both of your grits in one stone. It's not that expensive at around $70, and it's just a really convenient stone to work from. Now, the advantage to the Norton is that it's cheap, but the disadvantage to the Norton is that it tends to wear down fairly quickly, and the 4000 side wears down a lot faster than the 1000 side, and it also dishes out fairly quickly. And so what I've done recently is I've switched over to Shapton stones. Now, Shapton is a really well-respected, highly recommended sharpening brand. They have a ton of different grits, but I just chose to go with their 1000 grit stone and their 6,000 grit stone, and both of those together on Amazon ended up costing me $110, which is really pretty darn reasonable for a stone that's going to be a lot more durable. And at least my preliminary experience with these is that they cut just as fast as the Norton stone, but they are staying flatter for longer, which is really nice. So coming over to my sharpening station here, this is a pretty crude setup, but it's really all that you need to get the job done. I've gone ahead and I've put a towel down on my workbench because we're going to be spraying water and I don't want to make a mess here. I've got my 1000 stone and I've got my 6000 stone. I've got a Sharpie marker, I've got a little extra towel to clean up, and then of course I have my chisel and my planer blade. Now, the first thing I want to point out that may not be obvious is that tools generally don't come sharp. A chisel, unless it's a very high-end chisel or block plane, is going to come with machine scratches in it that are going to need to be worked out before you can really start setting your bevel. So the first step for a planer blade or a chisel is to flatten the back of the blade. So I'm going to start by spraying a little bit of water on the top of the stone here. Nice thing about these Shapton stones is you just have to splash them with water and they're ready to cut. For most other water stones, you need to keep them soaking in water and then you're going to take them out but you are going to spray them with water continuously while you're cutting. Now, to start flattening the back of the blade here, I'm going to go ahead and just put it down on top of the stone with both hands, and with firm, even pressure, I'm going to start working my way back and forth like this. Now, you can see all of that dark material on the top of the stone. That is all metal coming off the back of the blade. And what you want to do is just work this back and forth until when you clean this off, you can see that you've cut all of the deep scratches out of it. Now at that point, you can switch to your finer grit and you can do the same thing. Now, you don't have to do this very often. I flatten the backs of my planer blades or chisels occasionally, but really the main time that you do this is when one of them is brand new. Now, once you're done here, the back of your blade should look nice and shiny all along the entire front edge. All right, so now that we've flattened the back of the chisel and the back of the planer blade, now let's focus on the bevel. So let's start out with the honing guide here. Now what a honing guide is a little mechanical clamp with a roller wheel on it, and its job is to hold your chisel or your planer blade at a consistent angle with the surface of the stone so it cuts a nice even bevel. Now there's multiple styles of these. There's this style right here which can hold a planer blade on the top, and then if you spread it apart even further, you can put a chisel down in here. Now, there's lots of different ones of this particular style, and some of them don't hold a chisel very well because these notches are too small, and some of them don't hold a planer blade very well because it won't close down far enough. And I have yet to find a single one of these that can do all of my tools, but I'm still hoping to find it. This just happens to be the one I'm working with right now. Now, there is another style of this that's made by Veritas that has a brass wheel down below that's a little bit wider, and it has a thumb screw up top. And I used that style for many years, but my problem with those is that the chisel or planer blade is much more likely to slip in there. And also, while you're driving that style across the stone, it's much more likely that you'll accidentally catch the front edge, completely dulling the front edge and also damaging your stone. So these days I'm usually just using this style right here. So why don't we go ahead and set this up. I'm going to put my planer blade in here. I'm going to tighten it down. Now at this point I'll take a minute and find myself a really flat surface that I can use to judge the angle that the planer blade is meeting the surface here. Because if you try to do this just on a piece of wood or a sharpening stone, usually you can't see well enough to figure out what angle you're coming in at. Now, at this point, if looking very carefully at it, what you can do is slide the planer blade forward and back until you think you've matched that bevel right there. Now, incidentally, the angle on a low angle block plane is usually around 25 degrees, and that's perfectly fine. For chisels, I don't even think about the angle. I just try to match whatever angle they came with. Now, what some woodworkers will do is after they've ground this initially, they'll do what's called a micro bevel, which means that they do another bevel on top of their main bevel that's just slightly steeper. And the reason to do a micro bevel is because it gives you a super sharp edge super quickly. But the reason that I never do micro bevels is you get into this kind of micro bevel war where you're micro beveling and micro beveling and micro beveling, and pretty soon you've got such a steep micro bevel that you've got to regrind this entire surface if you want to be able to use your plane again. So in this case, I find the bevel the best that I can, and then at that point, you can just take a screwdriver and tighten this down. So now that I've got what I hope is going to be the right bevel here, I'm going to come over to my stones, I'm going to spray a little bit of water on them, and then putting this down on here like this, and holding it like this with your fingers at the front and your thumbs at the back, you're going to press down with even, firm pressure and work this front to back. Now, initially I only take a couple swipes, so I can turn this over and see if I actually matched my bevel. If I'm right on my bevel, I'm going to see a decent amount of change in the sheen of the surface across the entire blade face here. But if I'm taking too much off the back, you're going to see a bright line across the back, or if you're taking too much off the front, you're going to see a narrow, bright line across the front. Either one of those, you want to stop and adjust this and try to get right on your bevel before you really dig in and start cutting material here. Now, once you're sure that you like your bevel, you really want to tighten this down. You're going to put your fingers in the front, you're going to put your thumbs in the back, and you're really going to press fairly hard as you work this back and forth here. Now, like I said before, all water stones have a tendency to dish out over time, which means that if you work them right in the middle, they're going to dish out much faster. It's good if you can work all over the stone. So, really getting into this here. You can see all of that dark metal there coming off the blade. It's nice to clean it so you can see what you're doing. Now, a great way to know that you're getting all the way down to where you need to be is when you start seeing those little black lines start jumping off the front of the blade, because that means the front of the entire edge of the blade there is contacting this surface. So I'm just going to do a little bit more here. And that looks like I've gotten the job done there. I've got a nice dull surface across the entire back of the blade. I've been working on my 1000 grit stone here, and the ultimate way to know if you actually went far enough is to take your pinky and rub it across the back of the blade like this. And what you're feeling for is a little rough thing that catches your fingers called a burr. Now, if you can feel a burr all the way across the back side, that means you're done. And your final step, at least on the coarse stone, is to, with this still held in here, turn this over just like this. You're going to put this flat against the stone with your fingers like this, and you're going to push forward at a diagonal. And just a couple swipes, just like that, is all you need to cut the burr off the back side of the blade. So now let's switch to the finer stone here. Once again, same procedure. Fingers on the front, thumbs on the back. Try to work all around the stone. And then once you see sharp black lines jumping off the front of this, it means you're probably down to as far as you need it to go. Spray it a little bit with water. Now, if you leave your sharpening station somewhere where it's really easy to set up and you maintain your tools frequently, this only takes a couple minutes to put a really sharp edge on a blade. It's also a good idea to flip your stones around from time to time to make sure you're working on both ends. And I'm seeing little sharp black lines jumping off all the way across the front here, which means that I'm pretty much down to my bevel angle. And if I spritz off this, I've got a nice shiny edge across the front here. Now, I'm only going to 6000 right now, so this isn't a mirror finish, but it's pretty darn shiny. So that's what I'm looking for. Final thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put this flat upside down. And once again, I'm going to cut the burr off the back. Now, sometimes you can't feel the burr with grits that are coarser than 4000, but if you went all the way down, you definitely made a burr. So that's pretty much it there. We've gone ahead and sharpened that blade. It's going to be the exact same process with a chisel. Now, before we finish up here, I just want to take a minute and talk about what to do when your stones start to wear down, because all water stones are going to dish a little bit over time, which means they need to be periodically reflattened. Now, a little bit of dishing isn't a bad thing, because a slightly curved blade on the front of a block plane actually makes it run a little bit easier, and it's less likely to catch an edge and leave a drag mark. But if you let this sort of thing go too far, what's going to happen is it's going to be very hard to grind your blades back to true again, and also it gets harder and harder to flatten your stones. So the way that you want to deal with this is you want to get yourself a nice flat surface and a piece of fairly thick glass, and then put them together and put a piece of sanding screen right on top. And that's going to give you a dead flat surface where you can take your stone and you can scrub it over the sanding screen, and it'll be apparent right away how out of flat your stone is. And you're just going to keep working that until the entire thing is nice and flat again. Now, once you're sure that your stones are perfectly flat, the next step is to make sure that the bottom of your block plane is perfectly flat. Now, this may or may not matter, and honestly, I've got block planes around here that I've never even checked if the bottom is flat, and they work just fine. But if you've got a sharp blade in your block plane and it's not running very well, there's a good chance that the sole is out of true. Now, how you flatten a sole that's distorted really depends on how bad the problem is. If it's really distorted on the bottom, you're going to have to start with either some sandpaper spray glued down to a dead flat surface, like a 120 grit and a 220 grit, or you can get yourself a 325 grit diamond lapping plate. And I would say if you're going to make any addition to your sharpening system besides just a couple stones, it would be a 300 grit diamond lapping plate, because that'll let you flatten soles that are really out of true, and also it'll let you regrind the bevel on your chisels and your block planes. So the way to do this is first just to make sure that there's no crud underneath the adjustable throat here, and then once you're sure that that's clean, you can crank the adjustable throat really tight to make sure that it's really well seated. And then the next thing you're going to do is take a Sharpie and make a bunch of witness marks all the way across the bottom of the plane here. And this is going to tell you really quickly when you start scrubbing it where the high spots are and where the low spots are. Now, I already know that this block plane is pretty flat, so I'm going to start with my 1000 grit stone here. Now, incidentally, I don't actually use the side that I use for honing my chisels and my plane blades. I leave one side with a factory flat, and I only use that when I'm going to be flattening the backs of tools. Now, you can also see that I've screwed a stop down at the back here. This is never a bad idea because you don't want your stones sliding all over the place while you're trying to work. So I'm going to go ahead and spray some water on here, and then take my block plane. Now, when you're doing this, you want to make sure that you apply even pressure to the entire sole, because you'd be surprised at how much steel can flex a little bit if you're just putting shing down in one area. So with both hands over the top, I'm just going to work this back and forth. And then immediately I'll flip it over and just do a quick check to see what happened to my witness marks here. And you can see that these are already being mostly scrubbed off, which means that this is flat, and I knew it was going to be flat because I've already flattened this particular plane. So at this point, I would just take a moment and see how bad the problem is. After you've worked on the 1000 grit stone for a couple of minutes, if you've still got places where you're seeing witness marks, now you're going to have to think about backing up and either going to sandpaper or to a diamond lapping plate. And then once you've got all of your witness marks out, now you can go back to your 1000 grit stone. And then after that, you can go up to whatever the highest grit you feel like going to here. I would say the 6000 is just fine, but everybody has their own preferences there. All right, so putting the block plane back together here, the first thing I'm going to do is open the throat all the way up. I'm going to take the blade with the bevel facing up, and I'm going to set it in here right on top of the adjustment screw. Now, keep in mind that the adjustment screw has quite a range, and most of these blades have quite a bit of different notches that you can put them on. So if you get this in here and you find that the adjustment, when it's adjusted all the way in or all the way out, doesn't put this in the right place, all you've got to do is just slide the blade to the appropriate notch until it sits where you want it to. Now, at this point, you can just set the cap right on top here and lock it down. I'm typically adjusting the tension on this screw so that with the cap locked all the way down, I can still just barely engage or disengage the blade, and I can also move it a little bit side to side because you're going to be constantly tweaking this while you're actually doing your woodworking. So that's pretty much it for selecting edge tools and sharpening techniques for skin-on-frame boat building. One final word of caution here, you want to be careful when you're handling these blades because especially when you're finished sharpening, these are going to be super sharp and it'd be really easy to give yourself a serious cut. Now also keep in mind that everything you learned in this video is just the tip of the iceberg as far as learning how to tune up planes and chisels and all the various sharpening techniques that are out there. So if you're interested in that subject, there's a ton of resources out there. There's about a zillion videos on YouTube, and you can really dive into the minutia to make your tools run as good as they possibly can. The stuff that I showed you in this video is just the very basics of what you need to know to get your block plane running good so you can build a skin-on-frame boat. So that's pretty much it for now. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. You can also find me on our website, which is capefalconkayaks.com, where I've got a bunch more skin-on-frame building videos and various skin-on-frame resources. You can check me out on Instagram at capefalconbuilds, where I post a daily build blog of everything I do here in the shop, including time-lapse videos. That's it. Take care, be safe using your tools, and have fun building your skin boat.